Good morning and welcome to the second of the 6 events for the 2022 Healthy Working Lives seminar series. So today's topic is how the job gets done. You've got to do what you've got to do. So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Pritchard and a research fellow from the Driving Health Research team at Monash University, and I'll be your MC today. So it's fantastic to have you here. Whether you're here joining us live or watching the replay, welcome. We acknowledge the sacred land of the Wurundjeri people on which we are based and pay our respects to the thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge found with the Indigenous owners of the land. Wamonjaka, welcome, kia ora. In today's seminar, we have 3 guests that I'd like to introduce. The first is the lead researcher of the Driving Health Project from Monash University, Associate Professor Ross Iles. We also have Naomi Fraunfelder, who is the CEO of Healthy Heads in Trucks and Sheds Foundation, which is to promote prevention and understanding of mental health issues across road transport and logistics industries. And we also have joining us today, Associate Professor Sharon Newman. Now, Sharon is an organisational psychologist and Associate Director of the Systems Safety Team at Monash University Accident Research Centre. So for today's session, Ross will begin with a short presentation around the driving health findings relating to health impacts and relating to how we get the job done when they're driving on the road. And that will be followed by a short presentation from both Naomi and Sharon, and then a panel discussion as well. Then we will have a short round of Q&A at the end of the session. And so we ask that you submit any questions that come up for you along the way, and we'll ask again later on. You just scroll up under your screen and you'll see the button that says ask a question. So you can ask a question at any time and we have time for Q&A at the end. Right, I'd like to hand over without further ado to Associate Professor Ross Iles. We'll go to a short slide and then he'll come on with his presentation. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Welcome to the second Driving Health seminar. As Elizabeth mentioned, we've called this one How the Job Gets Done. You've got to do what you've got to do. And really looking forward to having a great discussion with some industry experts today. We've got Sharon and Naomi, who we'll introduce a little bit later. So as Elizabeth mentioned, we are going to present a little bit of what we found in driving health. And then we'll focus on the discussion around what those findings mean. And everything that will be presented today is available at drivinghealth.net. It's drawn from the series of Driving Health reports. And then also this seminar itself will be recorded and available. So if you head to drivinghealth.net, you'll find all the information that you need. So with the Driving Health Project, we've used a theoretical model to organise all the information and all the different factors that can influence driver health. And we've organised those different pieces of information into domains. And some of those domains overlap, and that's what we've tried to show in this picture here. So the personal domain covers things like the driver's age, their family situations, feelings about the job, those sorts of things. The workplace environment domain, we know the workplace environment is very specific for truck drivers. It includes not only their truck, but then also the places they go to deliver, to load and unload. In driving health, we've captured information around the lifestyle domain. So what drivers are doing in terms of what they eat, what they drink, how much exercise they get. But then also what factors about them that might influence their risk of developing health conditions. And that can be things like their weight, quality of sleep, and the medications that they take. And the outcomes that we've focused on with driving health have really focused on psychological distress and general health. But we've also captured information around near misses and drivers reporting their ability to do their job. So we've referred to those as driving outcomes. And then all of these factors sort of sit within what we refer to as the regulatory domain. So basically the rules and regulations that govern the transport industry. And today we'll actually be looking at the occupational domain. And you can see there's the different things that have been captured as part of the driving health study. We captured information about how drivers were paid, the type of driving that they did, even the vehicle that they were driving, but then also the nature of the tasks and the timing and scheduling of their work. And that was captured across 2 surveys, one that was done online and one that was done on the telephone. And that collectively represents nearly 1,400 drivers all around Australia. So with the approach that we've taken with driving health, we're actually able to look at all of the information across all of these factors at once, so we can actually identify which factors actually stand out more than others, even across different domains. And I'll take you through some of those in a moment. So when it comes to doing the job and outcomes, you can see in this table at the top there are the 4 outcomes I mentioned before. And when it comes to psychological distress, we found that age was a significant factor. And it was actually that older age actually resulted in, was more likely to report, I'll start that again. Older drivers were more likely to report lower levels of psychological distress. So it was the younger drivers who were actually reporting high levels of psychological distress. Working more hours actually led to increased psychological distress. And interestingly, the type of vehicle that drivers drove could actually impact the level of psychological distress that they reported. And that could be due to the nature of the driving that they do. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Across all of these outcomes, you can actually see that working more longer hours actually increased your chances of having poorer general health and a poorer quality of life in general. So the hours that drivers are required to work actually has quite an impact on their health. It's not really surprising that working more hours means you're more likely to have more near misses, because you're on the road more often. You're more likely to actually have issues with near misses. And the same with age. When we looked a little bit more carefully at the type of driving, and drivers that were characterised as short haul drivers, that is, they drove less than 500 kilometres a day, actually had higher levels of psychological distress. And we think this is a result of actually spending more time, for example, in traffic, where you're actually dealing with other drivers and the hazards that they cause when driving around trucks. Long haul drivers, however, were more likely to report high levels of pain, but they were less likely to report crashes. And again, that could be because of dealing with less traffic. And interestingly, we found that owner drivers were more likely to report their own health as being very good. So there's advantages to being an owner driver in terms of your health. A key component of the Driving Health Project was that we conducted interviews with drivers, but not only drivers, but their family members. And one of the key things that they identified was that they felt a lot of pressure to be on the road for those long hours every day. And we just talked about how those long hours impacted their health. But drivers described that as that by saying if the wheels aren't turning, then there's no income to support their family and the lifestyle that they've created. And if they experience delays with loading or unloading or miscommunication about loading times or places, that pressure increased. And that rising pressure of failing to meet their delivery times could translate into lower earnings for the week, but then also being in the boss's bad books. And then in such a competitive market where people are looking to save money, it can actually lead to that fear of being sacked. And several drivers actually recounted stories of being of their mates who are extremely stressed and in some cases suicidal over the financial pressures. When we looked at that a little bit further, one of the questions that we asked drivers was, would they be able to raise $2,000 in an emergency? The majority of drivers would be able to. And when we combined our financial stress questions, we categorised drivers into low or high stress, and just over a quarter of the drivers in that part of the survey report would be categorised as experiencing high financial stress. So clearly, how the job is done and how drivers are paid has an impact on drivers' well-being. I mentioned that we did interviews with family members, so here's just a couple of quotes. I'm not going to read them out. But here are some quotes about the impacts about how the job is done and how that can impact health and family life, basically. The first quote is about having to renegotiate how they're going to do life, how they're going to parent as a result of the nature of the work. And the second quote is actually about the impact of those, of those delays, how that impacts the body clock, how that changes the pressure from the bosses, and then how sometimes that ends up to actually driving when you feel tired, and when you're alert, that's the time you end up waiting. Another question that we asked was to actually have drivers to tell us how often a range of different events happened in their working life, whether that was about the dispatcher working with you to get you home as scheduled, and the different aspects of delays that drivers might face. And what we found, drivers very regularly said that almost 80%, you can see on this graph, said that at least monthly that the traffic congestion had a significant impact on delays. And for a good, 40% thereabouts of drivers, that would happen daily or almost daily. Arriving on time, but you're forced to enter a dock, forced to wait before you enter the dock. There's another that happens to drivers quite frequently, and that these experience delays that impact your driving hours. These are frequent events that are happening that are outside of drivers' control. And if there's a big impact of having to work longer hours, and if it has an impact on financial stress because you're not being paid for waiting time, that increases the pressure that drivers feel. Fortunately, what we find is that it is also really quite common that the dispatcher will actually work with the drivers to get them home as scheduled, it's a lower proportion of the time being allocated being unrealistically tight, and the delivery schedules are unrealistically tight. That's less common, but still probably happening more often than we would like. And when we were able to summarise these time and schedule variables, when we put drivers into low risk of being having a time and scheduling not working for them, the majority fell into a high risk category. So they were at high risk of actually experiencing delays outside of their control in the workplace. When we did our final analysis across all the factors, this is what we call a heat map that tries to show up the factors that were actually really quite important in the analysis. And I've focused on the ones from the occupational domain here. And the squares that are coloured in are the squares that tell us that those factors were actually important in the health outcomes that we found. And I've pointed to these ones here in terms of the type of driving that they did, the longer working hours, the type of payment that they received as to whether they were paid an hourly rate or a daily rate or a per delivery rate, and the type of shift that they worked were all actually important across those different the different outcomes of being workability, psychological distress, general health, and near misses. Then we also find here that when there are workers at high risks of the work tasks that they're doing, and there's high risk to their time and schedule, that drivers face a lot of those risks at work. So how the job is done is important, but there's also risks happening that actually increase the likelihood of poor health. And then for better general health, we found that being paid for delays was actually had an important impact on better general health. So that's a very quick overview of the information that we found in the driving health study around the occupational factors. I'm going to now introduce the first of our panellists, Naomi Fraunfelder. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is not as good as Elizabeth. Apologies for that, Naomi. But Naomi is the CEO of the Healthy Heads and Trucks and Sheds organisation. Naomi was previously the Executive Director of the Track Safe Foundation, an Australian rail industry not-for-profit that addressed suicide in the rail network and the resultant trauma caused to train drivers. And that's something that, that Naomi brings to leading healthy heads and trucks and sheds to strengthen and grow the organisation to work and improve mental health in the trucking and logistics industry. There's a strong Monash connection with Naomi, and I'd like to introduce her now.
Thank you very much, Ross. Pleasure to be here today and provide a bit of an update on Healthy Heads to everyone. So I'm assuming with the audience that would be along at one of these webinars you would have a pretty good understanding of healthy heads in trucks and sheds. But if you don't, by way of background, we're an industry-funded not-for-profit that has been set up to try to improve mental health and wellbeing outcomes across road transport, warehousing and logistics. We were launched in August 2020, so we're just sort of over 18 months old. And you might be aware of our National Mental Health and Wellbeing Roadmap strategy, which is on our website, and that basically is a 3-year strategy for industry around making improvements to physical and mental wellbeing for truck drivers, shed workers and anyone else that's within the industry. So I guess to build on that and just give you a brief update on what we've been up to since the roadmap launched in May last year, we have recently launched our roadshow. So you might have seen some media releases and stuff on LinkedIn about that. And so one of our foundation sponsors, Packer, has donated to us a DAF truck, and it's been branded as the Roadshow and is running about 20 events from now until October all around the country, so visiting every state. And basically to engage people that we may not be able to get to. They might not work for the big trucking companies in Australia. They might be more regional or remote. And this is a way for us to create places where people can connect. There'll be free coffee, barbecues. We've made little Z cards that have tips and tools, as well as all the sort of Beyond Blue and Lifeline phone numbers. So that's a chance to really get out and engage directly with the coalface of industry. So if you keep an eye on our website, we'll be updating with events as they are confirmed. We've also partnered with Are You OK for an industry-specific Are You OK Day. So Are You OK in Trucks and Sheds is launching on the 17th of May. And that's really, it's a great partnership because Are You OK's mission is a world in which we're all connected and hence protected from suicide. And we're representing an industry that's got some alarming mental health statistics. So this partnership will see us helping to tailor and extend the Are You OK resources specifically for our audience, so those people working in trucks and sheds. We've also got a new partnership with BP, so also a foundation partnership where we are looking at a healthier eating choices pilot, so working with BP service stations to offer discounts for truck drivers on healthier meal choices. So that's something we'll do through the Healthy Heads app, which is already out there and has a wellbeing check-in, some breathing exercises, but we'll be adding these new incentives around healthy meal choices with BP. And additionally, in that app, we have a partnership with a football club that's being announced shortly, and we'll be filming with their club psychologist as well as their exercise scientist around specific exercises that truck drivers and shed workers can do, as well as looking at some of the, managing fatigue and some of the issues that may be in common between professional drivers and professional athletes. So that's also in the works to add some exciting new content to our app. And finally, we're in the sort of first phase of a scoping study with one of the industrial property players in Australia around the development of a best practice heavy vehicle rest area. So like a gold standard of the best facilities that can be provided. So that's in currently sort of the scoping phase of the project, but we're planning to do, in my time in the industry, it's what I've heard again and again is that the rest stops are just not good enough and lots of improvements can be made. So that's another project that we're working on at the moment. And I might leave it there, Ross. I feel like that's lots of information, and there'll be time at the end, I think, for questions if anyone wants to know more about these projects or any other ones.
Thanks very much, Naomi. We really appreciate the support that Healthy Heads and Trucks and Sheds has provided to the driving health study throughout, and obviously, some fantastic initiatives underway. I'd also like to introduce Associate Professor Sharon Newman. Sharon is an Associate Director of the Systems Safety Team at the Monash University Accident Research Centre, MUARC. So there's an even stronger Monash connection going on today. Sharon has published widely in the area of workplace safety from a systems thinking perspective and has applied this knowledge to improve safety across industries, including transportation and healthcare. Sharon is also a member of the wider Driving Health Investigator team. So I'll hand over to Sharon.
Hello. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Ross. That was a great introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to come along and speak today. So as Ross said, I lead the systems safety team at the Monash University Accident Research Centre. So as many of you may already know, NEWARC for short is a multidisciplinary centre. So we have psychologists, statisticians, epidemiologists, and we deal in a range of workplace areas, and including workplace road safety. So this project, the Driving Health Project, it's been fantastic to work with Ross and the team on this project for over the last few years. And the results that have come out of this really highlight the importance of really what is prioritised within the systems safety team at NEWARC, and that's looking at safety from a systems thinking perspective. And by that, I mean, we're not only looking at what changes that drivers can make to their driving practices, their behaviour, their lifestyle, but it's about how employers can support drivers, how regulatory and government bodies can also provide some guidance on how to best support the industry. So it's a really exciting project because, as Ross showed in his initial slides, it's not only looking at one element of the transportation system. This project's really focusing on more than just the driver and the factors surrounding the driver, and looking at it from that systems thinking perspective. So within the NEWARC, we do a lot of research in workplace road safety, which very much aligns with this project. And I work closely with the National Road Safety Partnership Program, which is hosted by the Monash University Accident Research Centre. Jerome Carslake, director of that program, is very much involved in previous projects related to the health and wellbeing of workers in the transportation industry, and working directly with Naomi and her team in the past too. So there's lots of synergies in what we are actually doing. And it's great to know that there is a lot of research that has been undertaken in this area, as we want to definitely advocate that evidence-based approach to any type of intervention. And with that evidence-based approach, looking at ways that we can actually create systemic change within the system as well. So again, looking at how we can actually translate the findings of this research project into prevention efforts to ensure that not only safety, which is my primary focus, but looking at health and well-being of workers in the transportation industry as well. And as Ross has shown, this project has great translational value. It's been able to translate the findings of this research that can make actually fundamental changes in the transportation industry, which is something that we definitely do need, and definitely that the focus of research within Monash University more broadly as well. We want to create impact within the transportation industry, which is a high priority industry to focus on, not only from that safety perspective, but ensuring the health and well-being of workers. So that's a little bit of an introduction, I suppose, to what we do within NEWARC, the linkages with the Driving Health Project, and even with Naomi's work in the agency. So thank you very much for the invitation to come along and present today. And I understand that we're going to be having a panel discussion next, which is really great. And I'll be able to talk more in depth about that system safety approach and how we're linking it to health, wellbeing and safety within this industry. So thank you.
Okay, we've got Sharon and Naomi here, and so we're going to talk through a few things. I'm going to throw a few questions at Naomi and Sharon, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. My first question is for you, Naomi. The drivers we interviewed described an important coping method was actually being able to, the important coping method to deal with the stresses of driving was to be able to appreciate the moment. And they described this as being things like noticing the beauty of the countryside that they were driving through. Could be a sunset or a sunrise, or even just a conversation with someone. And when the drivers took the time to notice and experience the moment, they were able to savour it and experience physical and mental benefits as a result. How does this kind of approach and this kind of thinking fit in with what Healthy Heads and Trucks and Sheds is doing?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. That's fantastic to hear that there's already that recognition of sort of all of what you've said to me, I would say, is mindfulness. So being able to be present in the moment, and as a dedicated yoga student, it's all right up my alley anyway. So I'm thrilled to hear it, because I think it's really important, particularly everyone's lives are getting busier. They're juggling multiple different things. COVID has made the stresses a lot worse, as have natural recent disasters. So there's a lot on people's plates, particularly those at the coalface of trying to keep the economy moving in these times. So I think that's a great way of sort of just stopping and seeing how you feel and being mindful of the moment. And that feeds into a lot of what we do. I mentioned the app that we've got, and it's got within it just a really simple breathing exercise. I think it's inhale for 5, exhale for 5, but that's not dissimilar to stopping and actually looking at a beautiful sunset, or being very present when you're having a conversation with someone. So I think to see that those behaviours are already happening in the industry is awesome. And all of the work that we're doing is also based around, I think mindfulness is at the centre of a lot around mental health and psychology. So yeah, I'm really pleased to hear that.
I think it's great to get those words, particularly, from a driver, in particular, when sometimes things like mindfulness might actually be seen as something that's it's not particularly tough or macho. There's that image that it's that it's for softies or something like that, but it's actually what are the ways Healthy Heads and Trucks and Sheds are trying to sort of encourage some of those things that might have previously been really hard to communicate to a population like the stereotypical truck driver? Or
a lot of it is around, I guess, the language that you use and how you position it, and that's particularly also about reducing stigma, because you're indicating some of the big cultural issues we've got, particularly with a male-dominated and ageing workforce. And it was the same. I spent, as I think you mentioned previously, had about a decade in the rail industry and very similar issues. But by starting to make it, and part of it's just the Australian stereotypes as well that seem to be quite true. So part of it is just making it okay to say you're not okay and to talk about your feelings of what you're going through. And that's largely why we're doing this partnership with Are You OK for this industry-specific campaign. That's part of it. And I also think an important part is positioning it as part of your overall health. You cannot separate physical health and mental health. They're totally interlinked. So we do try to be cognizant of the messages we're putting out and the way we're phrasing it and the language we're using because of the audience. So positioning it within also physical health and just overall well-being is, we just don't want to talk about mental health nonstop, because also it becomes, people sort of stop listening or they've heard too much about it. So I think it's taking a very holistic whole of person approach as well.
Sharon, how does that sort of combination, or that partnership of physical and mental health, we do have that artificial distinction sometimes. How does that work with things like safety and even injury prevention?
Yeah, that really resonated when you said that, Naomi. And I think that you really can't distinguish between the three. Safety, health and wellbeing are very much interrelated. And I don't think it's well recognised. And so I do come from the injury prevention perspective, but when we're looking at from that systems thinking perspective, that the factors that are contributing to health, wellbeing and safety are all very similar. So, and not only looking at those factors at the driver level, but the factors at higher levels of the system that support a driver's health and well-being in terms of what's happening at operations management level, for example, scheduling of trips for drivers, up to the role of regulators, such as the guidance material provided by regulators into ensuring health and well-being and safety of drivers. So it's all very interlinked. And I think if we look at it from that holistic perspective, I think we can start looking at how we develop interventions that are a lot more targeted at the key issues that we're trying to address, and not only intervention at that driver level, but looking at how we can better support regulators and in terms of being able to sufficiently educate employers, for example, and owner-operators in terms of intervention for improving health and wellbeing, and just monitoring of health and wellbeing issues is one way in which that can be done. And that feedback loops can then go back into better defining what that guidance material could be, again, from regulators. So I think it's really important to have those conversations at multiple levels of the system to ensure that safety, health and wellbeing are going to be interrelated, and how each of those outcomes can actually feed back into the development of targeted intervention at all levels of the system.
I think one of the key messages we're trying to get across with the Driving Health project is that complex problems require complex solutions, and it really does require looking at multiple parts of the system. Just doing things at one level on its own is not going to. It might improve things a little bit, but we need a much bigger. We need bigger impact, basically. And I think to achieve that, we need the things happening at multiple levels of the system working together. In my mind, that's what that systems thinking is all about. It's not a particularly technical way to describe it. But one thing that I mentioned earlier is that we know drivers, they work long hours. They work hard to get the job done. And they told us when we interviewed them that they do that without much appreciation or recognition for the importance of their role and what they contribute to society. I think it's been really highlighted, particularly recently with the pandemic. But I guess from each of your perspectives, how can we make sure that we look after drivers and that they get the recognition that they deserve for the important job that they do?
So I'm happy to go first. So I think it's a really, really, really important issue, and sort of the role of truck drivers in keeping the economy going during COVID. Like, we sat behind the safety of our desks, ordering everything online, and they were out there delivering it, risking their own health, I guess. So we actually did an industry recognition campaign at the end of last year with support from the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, and it's still on YouTube. Ross, we could always share it after if anyone wants to see it, but it was basically a really simple recognition of the people that have been out there making those deliveries, and just encouraging people, I guess, to stop and consider that. And you hear about people getting angry in traffic and sort of hooting at trucks and all of these things, or when they're pulling up to make deliveries. And probably before I worked in this industry, I'd never stopped to think about the role that they're playing and how tough those jobs are. So I think it's about trying to, and this was a public-facing campaign, so it was very much around building public awareness of the really critical role these people are playing. So I think that's a big part of it, as well as, recognising the jobs is also things like the heavy vehicle rest area project we're doing. Like, it's providing adequate facilities for people that are out there, sort of their careers are on the road. So it's starting to recognise that and provide them with sort of what they need to make them comfortable, as well as mentally and physically sort of safe and healthy. So I think there's a few things that need to be done, and I think it's a long time overdue. I think they've always been taken for granted, and there's not been a whole lot directed at specifically supporting them. And similar with our roadshow, it's also getting out into regional areas and sort of saying, this is for you. Like, we want to hear what your issues are. What else can we be doing? So I think there needs to be targeted approaches, so it's not just sort of an afterthought. Like, we're delivering programs specifically for truck drivers and similarly for those working in distribution centres and warehouses.
I will jump in here and provide some comment on that as well. And I think it's completely, it's fantastic what you were saying there, Naomi. And just to add to that, I think it's about actually having those conversations with the drivers themselves. We don't know what we don't know. And it's very easy, let's say, being an academic and being able to say what evidence-based suggests what we should do, even from the data that we analyse that comes from drivers. But having those conversations is where we get the rich information, particularly in relation to not only the targeting specific interventions, knowing what the key issues are, but more importantly, that implementation. And I think this is where it comes to understanding that the contextual issues that are influencing workers in the transportation industry. It's a very unique environment, being out in the vehicle, outside the physical boundaries of the organisation. There's low visibility with co-workers, with supervisors, with management. So that actually has incredible challenges particularly from a safety management perspective, but in terms of that isolation issues as well, and being able to self-manage your work practices and to be in that environment on a daily basis has incredible challenges. And so, really hats off to drivers, particularly the long haul drivers, that, as we found in the driving health studies, being away from family, work, balancing work and personal life is incredibly challenging. So that in itself, work-life balance, is an incredible challenge. We need to be creative in the way that we design interventions to ensure that they're going to be feasible and practicable when they're implemented as well. And I think that all the evidence base in the world in terms of effectiveness of interventions is not going to help if they cannot be implemented in a way that is going to resonate with the drivers themselves. And that information only comes from having those conversations. So one thing that I really encourage is that this concept of we don't know what we don't know. So until drivers tell us, and other key stakeholders in the system tell us what are the challenges, we can't get to that next stage of really effectively implementing these evidence-based solutions that we come up with. And I think this all leads into what Ross originally asked about legitimising the industry, acknowledging how powerful this role is in Australia and how important the transportation workers are, and then being able to overlay that with this understanding that we actually have a clue in terms of what are your key challenges. We want to have a clue, but we can't have a clue. We don't have a clue until we're actually told. So those conversations will give us that incredible insight to be able to implement these interventions that we're discussing here in a way that really does make us aware of those key challenges in the industry and what is actually going to resonate with workers as well. So I think that that's our next stage. I think the evolution of what we're trying to achieve here is create an evidence base for intervention, really understand what those key challenges are, and then being able to implement. And I see that as being a way that we can create change and acknowledge what those key challenges are for workers in the transportation industry. And so I think from that systems thinking perspective, I think it's a very holistic approach to how we're actually going to change the culture in the industry and improve the health, safety and well-being of workers.
As you're talking, Sharon, I was thinking of the seminar that we ran on Monday. We had Ron Hadafy in his truck. He was parked by the side of the road, and one of the things that he mentioned was, the industry is so broad in terms of drivers delivering different loads, different vehicles, whether it's construction, whether it's milk, things that need to arrive, quickly. FMCG, is that what the abbreviation usually used? Fast moving consumer goods versus live cattle, etc. And not only are there a wide range of tasks to do, but then there are so many drivers out on the road. There are so many loading, distribution centres, etc. How can we reach that? The audience that we're looking for, the drivers, when their tasks are so distributed. How can we get that information? How can we reach the people that we really want to reach? I'm interested in your thoughts on the challenges and how we might be able to approach that.
Naomi, did you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in here?
Sorry, I thought that was for you, Sharon. You go.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think reaching the target audience is something that certainly does need to be addressed, without a doubt. And I think that that's always been one of the challenges that I've come across in my research, is being able to, how do we actually get to that audience in the first instance, and to understand the complexity of the job role, as you say, as well, because sometimes it is so incredibly complex that those challenges in terms of reaching the target audience, reaching even down to the work group structure or the organisational structure, who has the most contact with the driver. So if intervention was to target the supervisor, for example, who is defined as the person who's accountable for the health, safety and wellbeing of that driver, is that the target person for the intervention, or is it the person that's in more of the role of organising the work roles schedule, such as the dispatcher? Do they have more visibility with the driver? So who has the greatest power, essentially, to create a context in which safety, health and wellbeing is prioritised, and that resonates with the driver? So just taking a step back and looking at the challenges of the transportation industry sort of gives us some insight into what I'm saying here. And you have a look at manufacturing, for example. You have individuals that work inside the physical boundaries of the organisation. There's a supervisor generally there that oversees the operations of the work practices. They can give timely feedback, and they can give effective goal setting based on that timely feedback. So feedback and goal setting are the two most powerful incentives for change in the workplace. Now you look at the transportation industry, you don't have that arrangement, because the drivers are working outside the physical boundaries of the organisation. There's not that direct oversight. There's low visibility. So who is the person, first of all, that's reaching the drivers? And who is actually responsible? Is it the person that is named the supervisor, or is it the person in the role of the dispatcher? So I think actually acknowledging who has the power and being able to create that climate or culture in which safety, health and wellbeing is prioritised is the first question that we should be asking. And that does change depending on what the job role is and what the core business activity. So if we can actually reach that person and then being able to create intervention that's going to resonate with the drivers, or, you could take it from a different perspective and look at a community perspective, how community could play a role in creating that culture where safety is and health and wellbeing is prioritised with driver. So in community, is there particular agencies in the community, such as yours, Naomi? How do we actually do that? So it's finding who has the power to create a message that's going to best resonate with the drivers in the first instance. And that's based on that role aspects or characteristics such as credibility. So I think that is one of the questions that we probably need to tackle in the first instance, and then look at the work role itself.
And I would echo what you've said there, Sharon. My other thought is that, as you were saying, Ross, the sort of diversity of roles in industry, and you mentioned Rod Hannafy, who sits on our standards working group. So we talk to him a lot about what we're doing. But that is also something that we're really thinking about, because, long haul, as then couriers, people that are isolated, going across the country, that there's a lot of different factors which also feeds into the heavy vehicle rest area project I've mentioned. So I think there's different, we know what the industry risk factors are for truck drivers, but they are different depending on the specific role. And then the question around audience, and not just in terms of delivering the message, but reach. I think we're all aware there's 53,000 trucking companies in Australia. 50,000 of them make less than $2 million a year. So being able to get to smaller family businesses, owner drivers that may not be part of the unions or may not be part of an association remains for us one of our biggest challenges. And we try to use all of our big players using their sort of subcontractors and customers, and we're trying to spread the message through every channel we can, but that remains a really big challenge. And then we do things like toolbox talks for supervisors to deliver directly to truck drivers and that. But there's one thing tailoring to the audiences, but then it's also reaching many of these key groups that we continue to sort of be challenged by.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask one more question, and it's I want to leave enough time for questions from people listening and watching, but I really want to ask this one. So we called this seminar, getting the job done. You've got to do what you've got to do, and it's that Aussie mentality that it's usually seen as a good thing. You just do whatever you've got to do to get the job done. So from your perspectives, what are the risks associated with that attitude in the transport industry?
I think the biggest risk is lack of acknowledgement that you're operating a complex piece of machinery, and that often people think that the driving task is, well, you've got a license, it's an easy thing to do, but the complexity of heavy machinery is often overlooked in the role of in the transportation industry. It is a complex task. It requires knowledge, it requires skill development, and it requires that positive mental state as well. And often that is overlooked because people have a light vehicle license. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that will, again, start, if that's well acknowledged, it can go into legitimizing this industry and acknowledging how challenging this task is, and those contextual factors, the challenges of those contextual factors for transportation workers, such as all the things that emerged in the driving health study regarding the working conditions and demands on drivers.
And yeah, my thoughts on that are, and I don't know how to solve the problem, Ross, but it's generally at the expense of your own sort of health and wellbeing, which is exactly what we're talking about. Like, yes, we're probably all familiar, even in totally different circumstances, of pushing through to get something done, to deliver on a deadline or on something, but it's at the expense of something. Like, you're either not seeing family or not eating well, not exercising. Like, there's always going to be a cost. So and that speaks to the much larger, I guess, systemic issues and the pressure the industry's been under, as well as, once again, to this Australian culture and mentality of just, suck it up and get it done. So I think there's a lot we've got to break down in terms of culture, stigma, as well as some of the very real operating environments and constraints. But I think, there's the safety risk, the very real safety risks that Sharon's talked about. And then I would just say there's all of the mental health and physical wellbeing implications of just sort of putting your head down and getting it done at your own expense. But there's lots of steps we've got to take in culture and stigma, but I don't have a quick solve.
I was hoping you just solve it for us on the spot. That would have been nice. What I'm going to do, we're going to pause now, and through the magic of this platform, in a moment, we'll be able to come back with some questions that people have entered as we've been chatting.
Fantastic. Thank you for the information that you've shared, everybody. It's wonderful. We've got some questions coming in right now. So the first one is from Greg, and this is specifically to Ross. I noticed your slide that discussed the finding that hours of work affected levels of psychological injury, general health, quality of life, and their misses. I'd be interested to know in your thoughts on the recent decision by the NTC, after representatives from the industry have had their input as well. Their review of the national law will not involve reducing hours of work for truck drivers. Can you talk a little bit around that, please?
This is an important point where I say that I'm a researcher. I'm not from the transport industry, so I just need to put that in there. I think, and where I'm going to be drawing my response from is from what drivers told us in the study, is that drivers actually want the ability to be able to, control their own scheduling, and drivers know when they're ready to drive and when they're not. And we also know that sometimes regulations can get in the way, and they have unintended consequences. And so it's a typical answer where I'm almost sitting on the fence to say, well, there needs to be some flexibility in terms of the hours that drivers are allowed to work and can work. I think, from my perspective, and it's a biased perspective, it's a researcher perspective, that the priority in terms of setting or identifying what's a reasonable workload or what's a reasonable time to drive actually needs to have the driver's health, well-being, their safety, like Sharon said, that your safety and your well-being needs to be central to that discussion, and that what the impression that I get is what is actually dominating the hours that work are the commercial aspects, and what we're seeing the result of that is that it's having that impact on driver health. Drivers are unhealthy, they are getting broken by the pressures, and if you actually put that driver health, well-being and safety at the centre of that discussion about the hours that should be worked, then we can actually be changing some of those outcomes.
I think that sort of links to a sort of an offshoot of the next question to Greg as well, and then we've got some other ones coming in as well. So how forthcoming with drivers within the study in respect to their compliance with working hours, rest breaks, keeping records, and just basically complying to the regulations? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, we actually asked the drivers about their regulation breaking behaviours in terms of the things that they did and how often they had to speed, for example, how often they took shorter rest breaks than required. There were a number of them, and we actually put up a slide in the first seminar, which actually demonstrated how often drivers reported that they broke those regulations. And so please, that you can view that presentation on demand. I don't have the figures on the top of my head, sorry. But it's important to say, well, the context of those regulation breaking behaviours, it is not about actually saying, well, there are drivers that are intentionally doing things that they know that they shouldn't be, but they're being put into a position where they have to make an extremely difficult choice of, I can make my delivery on time, or I can follow the regulations. I might have 10 minutes left in my driving window, but the truck stop is actually 30 minutes up the road. Do I stop where I am, park illegally, risk a fine, or do I keep going to reach the rest area and be over time and potentially risk being pulled up? It's an impossible situation that needs to be, that the driver needs to negotiate, and there's pressures on top of them. They know if they do, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. So I think to answer the question, drivers did seem to be quite forthcoming in terms of how often they actually were in a position where they had to break regulations. And please jump onto the platform. You can see the recorded presentation, or contact me through drivinghealth.net. Happy to share that information with you. It's in report number 8.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And this next question is sort of open for everybody, please. Any specific approaches for farmers and ag transport industry? This is from Richard, and he's thinking about health and wellbeing in that arena, and anything around the management of hours or deliveries or the link to logistics, and also the current pressures with logistics that are increasing because of COVID, for specifically the farmers and agriculture industry from your perspectives.
I haven't dealt with gone into the agricultural industry, but I'm very, very keen to, because it has been considered to be one of the priority areas. So I think that looking again, just what Ross was talking about before, about the different work tasks, and obviously oftentimes in the agricultural industry, the driving task is considered to be secondary to the primary job task. And that creates some challenges in terms of balancing the conflicts between safety and well-being and efficiency and productivity. So I think that sort of balance needs to be acknowledged, first of all, in terms of being able to implement any intervention that's going to be or resonate and be targeted with the audience itself. Regarding the key factors that are influencing the safety in terms of development of intervention, again, I think it's understanding what those conflicts are in greater detail, and being able to apply that knowledge to develop intervention that's particularly targeted. And I'd be keen to explore that in more detail. So I'm very happy if you're keen to reach out and have a discussion about that, because I think there are specific interventions that could be developed, particularly for agriculture, and very much targeting that part of the workforce and the challenges in terms of implementation of any intervention.
Wonderful. And I'm going to link that to the next one and ask Naomi if you've got a response, sort of linking that previous question about agriculture as well, to this one has from Rosalind. Has there the contextual circumstances of COVID, bushfires, flooding, etc., over the last couple of years impacted the industry, and has this come up in the research and conversations that each of you are having? So Naomi, can you go for that just in the last few minutes?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's, in our roadmap that I mentioned, which is sort of a 3-year industry strategy, it sets out key industry risk factors being fatigue, isolation, disconnect, potential exposure to a PTE, all of these things. But then the added pressure from the last couple of years, particularly the pandemic and the lockdowns and the issues at state borders, we were seeing heavy vehicle rest areas or bathrooms and that being closed to truck drivers because they'd travelled from another state and because of the COVID risk. So all it has done is compounded the level of stress and made a lot of the issues worse. At the same time, there's been a positive in terms of it shining a light on the critical role of truck drivers for the economy. So it was a bit of a two-pronged, yes, it's made things worse, which is awful, but it's also started to drive more recognition and work around this area. It's helped us to garner support across industry to try to make a difference. So, and back to the agriculture question, we have been speaking to some of the livestock associations, the livestock transport associations, as well as forestry. So I would also be very interested to understand more probably about the roles and specific risk factors for those working in farming and ag, but not something we haven't really addressed yet. But yeah, and also with the flooding and that, like it's just adding pressure. And all these organisations just working around the clock and the drivers. So I think everything we're doing in this space, and there's got to be sort of continued efforts from governments, regulators, industry to help try to improve.
Wonderful. So we're going to do a quick round robin just in the last minute. Give you 20 seconds each. What is one thing we could do to shift from conversations to action to making a change? Go, Ross.
Oh, I was hoping you would ask me last. I'm using up my valuable seconds. My opinion is I think that we need to try some things. Sometimes we go, the problem's so complex, it's really hard, and we just sort of then get stuck. I think some things we need to try and we need to be prepared to fail.
Wonderful. Sharon.
I think that we have to look at what is actually going to be feasible and practical for implementation. The best evidence-based solutions are not going to be effective unless that we can understand what those key challenges are in terms of implementation.
Fantastic. And Naomi?
I would say we don't need to move away from conversations, particularly if they're "are you okay" conversations. They're going to help drive the change and reduce the stigma. So I know what you mean in terms of just us talking here or something, but I think having these conversations with everyone across industry, particularly those on the front line, is critical going forward.
Fantastic. That is wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for contributing to the session today. We're gonna wrap up in just a minute, so stay with us. Thank you so much to the panel members, and we have got the connections for the next event. We're coming through to you live very soon, so stay tuned, and we're back in just a moment. Well, thank you everybody for attending the second event in the 2022 Healthy Working Lives Seminar Series. We're hosting 6 events during March looking at driving health. And the next event is next Monday, the 14th of March, 12 noon until 1 p.m. AEDT. So the topic is everyone deserves to be safe at work, how the big players are leading the way. And we will be featuring guest speaker, Chris Wilkes, who's the Group Manager in Safety, Health and Wellbeing Manager from Lynn Fox. And I will be presenting some of the results from the driving health study and also chatting with our special guest on Monday. So that's Monday, the 14th of March, 12 noon. Make sure you register if you haven't yet. Register for the next events to keep in touch with what's happening and our dissemination of this information of this incredibly valuable study. And for more information, make sure you go to drivinghealth.net. And we hope to see you very soon next week.